73 isn't an age when a man should stand at his own front door and feel like a trespasser. But that's exactly how I felt as my son's black BMW turned into the gravel driveway leading to the lakehouse, the place Caroline and I had spent 45 years building into something more than just wood and stone. The October afternoon was crisp, the kind that made the maple trees around Lake Harriet burst into flames of red and gold. I'd been in the garage tinkering with the old Johnson outboard motor that Caroline always said I'd never fix, but would never throw away either. She was right about most things. The smell of motor oil and autumn leaves filled the air, mixed with the lingering scent of the apple pie I'd baked that morning. Caroline's recipe, though mine never turned out quite as flaky as hers. Through the garage's side window, I watched 4 people emerge from the BMW. Ethan first, my 38-year-old son, wearing that charcoal business suit that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. Then Madison, his wife of 3 years, her blonde hair perfectly styled, despite the wind coming off the lake. Behind them came her parents, Harold and Patricia Worthington, looking like they were stepping onto a movie set rather than visiting family. I wiped my hands on the old rag Caroline had embroidered with "World's Best Mechanic," a Christmas gift from 1987, when my hands were steadier and my back didn't remind me every morning that I wasn't 25 anymore. Setting down my wrench, I walked toward the house, my work boots crunching on the gravel path Caroline and I had laid stone by stone during the summer of '89. The kitchen door opened before I reached it. Ethan stood there, but something was different about his posture. Gone was the easy smile he'd worn as a boy when he'd burst through that same door after fishing trips, eager to show off his catch. This was the stance of a man conducting business. "Dad?" He didn't move aside to let me enter my own kitchen. "Ethan?" I nodded toward Madison and her parents, who had arranged themselves around the old oak table like they were settling in for a board meeting. "Folks," Madison's smile was the kind they teach in corporate training seminars, bright but never reaching the eyes. "Hi, Frank. We hope you don't mind us stopping by. We have some things we need to discuss." The coffee pot was still warm from my morning brew. I moved toward it, muscle memory guiding me to the cabinet where Caroline had kept the good china, the set we'd bought for special occasions that had become increasingly rare over the years. But Ethan's hand on my shoulder stopped me. "Dad, maybe you should sit down first." Something cold settled in my stomach. In 45 years of marriage, Caroline and I had faced plenty of difficult conversations around this table. The night we learned she was pregnant with Ethan, the afternoon the doctor called with her test results, the morning we discussed funeral arrangements. But this felt different. This felt like an ambush. I pulled out my usual chair, the one with the slightly wobbly leg that I'd been meaning to fix for 3 years. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Caroline had wanted to replace it with hardwood, but we'd always found something more pressing to spend the money on. Ethan's college tuition, the new roof after the storm of '03, Caroline's medical bills. Harold Worthington cleared his throat. He was a man who'd made his fortune in real estate development, and it showed in the way he surveyed the kitchen like he was calculating square footage and renovation costs. "Frank, we want you to know how much we appreciate everything you've done for Ethan and Madison." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire you can't quite locate. I looked at my son, searching for some clue about where this conversation was heading. Ethan was studying his hands, manicured hands that had never held a fishing rod or learned to change engine oil. "We've been talking," Madison continued, her voice taking on that careful tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news while trying to make it sound like good news. "About the future, about making sure everyone's needs are met." Patricia Worthington, who'd remained silent until now, leaned forward. She was a thin woman with the kind of jewelry that caught light from every angle. "You see, Frank, Harold and I aren't getting any younger either. We're looking at our options for retirement, and we've fallen absolutely in love with this area. The lake, the peace, and quiet." My coffee mug sat cooling in front of me. Caroline had bought it at a craft fair in Stillwater. "World's Greatest Fisherman," in blue letters that had faded over the years. I wrapped my fingers around it, feeling the familiar chip on the handle where I'd dropped it years ago, rushing to answer the phone when Caroline called from the hospital. "What they're trying to say," Ethan finally spoke, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. is that we've worked out an arrangement. The Worthingtons need a place to retire, and this house, well, it's been in your name alone since Mom died. The room seemed to tilt slightly, like when you stand up too fast after sitting for too long. Ethan, what are you saying? Madison reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her skin was soft, moisturized, warm from the heated car seats. We know this must be overwhelming, Frank. But we've already spoken to our lawyers. The paperwork has been filed. As of yesterday, the deed transfer went through probate. Harold and Patricia are the new owners of the lakehouse. The words didn't make sense at first. They felt foreign, like someone speaking a language I'd never learned. I looked around the kitchen, at the wall where Caroline had hung her collection of vintage spoons, at the windowsill where her African violets still bloomed despite my questionable gardening skills, at the refrigerator covered with magnets from every trip we'd taken together. I don't understand. My voice sounded strange, distant. This is my house, our house. Ethan's jaw tightened. Dad, you're 73 years old. You're living alone in a house that's too big, too isolated. What happens when you fall? When you have a medical emergency? We're thinking about your safety. My safety? I repeated the words slowly, like I was learning their meaning. And where exactly do you think I'll be safe? Harold pulled out a folder from his briefcase. Expensive leather, the kind that whispers rather than creaks when opened. We've found an excellent facility in Minneapolis, Sunset Manor. It has full medical staff, activities, meals provided. You wouldn't have to worry about maintaining this big place anymore. The afternoon light was shifting, growing longer, casting different shadows across the table. In that light, I could see Caroline's ghost sitting in her usual spot by the window, her reading glasses perched on her nose, working on the crossword puzzle she never finished the morning. She didn't wake up. Madison's voice cut through my thoughts. We know it's a big change, Frank, but the papers are already signed. We've arranged for a moving company to come next week to help you pack the things you'll want to keep. Just the essentials, of course. Ethan stood up, straightening his tie with the same gesture I'd watched him practice before job interviews, before his wedding, before every important moment in his adult life. But now it felt like armor, a barrier between us. This isn't your house anymore, Dad. The words hit like a physical blow. Not just the meaning, but the tone. Flat, final, without even a trace of the boy who used to build blanket forts in the living room and beg me to read just one more story before bedtime. I sat there, surrounded by the people who were supposed to be my family, and felt completely alone. The coffee in my mug had grown cold. The apple pie on the counter would go uneaten. The outboard motor in the garage would remain unfixed, because after next week, it wouldn't be my garage anymore. But I didn't argue. I didn't shout or demand explanations or threaten to call my own lawyer. Instead, I did what Caroline had taught me to do when life threw something unexpected at us. I observed. I watched the way Madison kept glancing at her parents for approval. I noticed how Ethan avoided making direct eye contact. I saw Harold calculating something on his phone, while Patricia examined the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Most of all, I felt the house around me, the creaking floorboard in the hallway, the way the late afternoon sun painted golden rectangles on the living room carpet, the distant sound of waves lapping against the dock I'd built with my own hands the summer Ethan turned 16. When they finally left, their BMW disappearing back down the gravel driveway, I remained sitting at the kitchen table. The shadows had grown longer, cooler. Somewhere across the lake, a loon called out. That haunting sound that Caroline always said was the voice of the lake itself. I looked at the empty chairs around the table, at the coffee mug with my name on it, at the kitchen that had witnessed 45 years of breakfasts, holiday dinners, quiet conversations, and morning coffee shared with the woman I'd loved since I was 25 years old. Then I stood up, walked to the sink, and washed the dishes. 4 coffee cups, and a plate that had held store-bought cookies Madison had brought, as if this were a social visit. As I dried each piece with the dish towel Caroline had sewn from fabric left over from Ethan's childhood curtains, I began to think. 73 might be old, but it wasn't dead. And if my son thought he could erase 45 years of memories with a few legal documents and a business suit, he was about to learn something about his old man that he'd apparently forgotten. I walked out onto the deck, where Caroline's rocking chair still sat facing the lake. The sun was setting now, painting the water in shades of copper and gold. In the distance, I could hear the sound of Harold's BMW starting up from somewhere down the road. They'd probably driven around the lake to get another look at their new property. The evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from someone's fireplace and the earthy smell of autumn leaves. I sat down in Caroline's chair and began to rock slowly, the way she used to when she was thinking through a problem or working out the details of a plan. Tomorrow, I would drive to town and have a conversation with Marcus Wheeler, the lawyer who had handled Caroline's estate. Tonight, I would sit here with her memory and remember what it felt like to be a man who didn't back down from a fight, especially when everything he'd built with the love of his life was at stake. The loon called again, and this time, it didn't sound mournful. It sounded like a challenge. The drive back to my main house in town took 23 minutes. The same 23 minutes it had taken for 45 years, except tonight, the familiar route felt like traveling through a foreign country. Every landmark seemed different somehow. The old Miller farm where Caroline used to stop for fresh corn looked smaller, shabbier. The antique shop where we'd found our dining room table had a for lease sign in the window. Even the streetlights seemed dimmer, casting longer shadows that made me think of things ending rather than beginning. My house on Elm Street was a modest 2-story colonial that Caroline and I had bought when Ethan was 12, and we thought we needed to be closer to his school, his friends, his life. The lake house had been our weekend retreat then, our summer sanctuary, our retirement dream. Now it was Tuesday night, and I was sitting in my kitchen staring at walls that had never quite felt like home the way the lake house did. The silence was different here. At the lake, silence was filled with the sound of water against the shore, wind through the pines, the distant call of wildlife. Here, silence was just empty, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the mantel clock, the occasional car passing on the street outside. I made myself a sandwich, turkey and Swiss on the bread Caroline used to buy, though I never could remember which brand she preferred. Everything I did felt automatic, muscle memory carrying me through the motions, while my mind tried to process what had happened that afternoon. Ethan's words kept echoing, "This isn't your house anymore." When had my son become a stranger? When had the boy who used to help me stack firewood and organize my tackle box turned into a man who could sit at my kitchen table and calmly inform me that he'd given away the place where his mother and I had been happiest? I pulled out the photo albums Caroline had meticulously maintained for 45 years. The early ones showed a young couple in love, Caroline with her dark hair flowing past her shoulders, me with a full head of hair and arms that could lift her off her feet without my back screaming in protest. There we were on our wedding day, dancing at our reception in the church hall where her mother had insisted we hold it. Caroline's dress was simple but elegant, and her smile could have powered the entire town for a week. The progression through the albums told the story of our life together. Ethan as a baby, fat and happy in Caroline's arms. Ethan's first steps on the deck of the lake house. Christmas mornings in the living room with the tree Caroline insisted on decorating the day after Thanksgiving every year. Birthday parties, graduations, family vacations to the Boundary Waters where Ethan learned to canoe and I taught him to read the stars. Somewhere around album 4, I began to notice the changes. Ethan in high school, standing slightly apart from Caroline and me in family photos, that look teenagers get when they're ready to be anywhere but where they are. Then college photos where he appeared more confident, more polished, but also more distant. His smile was still there, but it had changed, become more practiced, more careful. The wedding photos were the hardest to look at. Ethan and Madison on their wedding day, surrounded by the Worthingtons and their country club friends. Caroline and I stood at the edge of most photos, dressed in our best, but clearly not belonging to this world of designer gowns and champagne fountains that cost more than our yearly grocery budget. I remembered the conversation Caroline and I had that night, back in our hotel room after the reception. "He's happy," she'd said, sitting at the room's small desk, taking off the earrings she'd worn only twice, once to our own wedding, once to our son's. "He is," I'd agreed, though something felt off to me even then. "Madison seems nice enough." Caroline had paused in brushing her hair, still thick and beautiful, though shot through with silver by then. "Did you notice how she kept looking to her parents before she spoke? Even when someone asked her about the honeymoon plans? I had noticed, but I'd chalked it up to wedding day nerves. Now, looking back, I wondered if Caroline had seen something I'd missed. She was always better at reading people, at sensing the undercurrents that ran beneath polite conversation. The last album was the hardest to open. Caroline's final year, when the cancer returned with a vengeance and the treatment stopped working. Photos became rarer, more precious. Ethan visited less frequently, always with a good reason, always apologetic, but always somewhere else when we needed him most. The final photo was one I'd taken without Caroline knowing. She was sitting in her chair on the lakehouse deck, wrapped in the quilt her mother had made, watching the sun set. Her face was thin, her hair gone, but her eyes were still bright, still full of the wonder she'd brought to every day of our marriage. She died 2 weeks later, in the hospital in Minneapolis, while Ethan was at a business conference in Denver that he said he couldn't reschedule. I closed the album and sat back in my chair. The sandwich sat untouched on the plate beside me. My phone buzzed. A text message. It was from Ethan. "Dad, I know today was difficult, but this is for the best. Harold and Patricia are good people, and they'll take care of the lake house. The moving company will be there Friday morning. I'll try to stop by before then to help you decide what to keep." I stared at the message for a long time. The casual tone of it, the assumption that the matter was settled, the way he spoke about Harold and Patricia as if their comfort mattered more than the life his mother and I had built together. I typed and deleted several responses. Anger, pleading, confusion. None of them felt right. Finally, I simply wrote, "We need to talk." His response came quickly. "I know this is hard, but you'll be much happier at Sunset Manor. They have activities, other people your age. You won't be so isolated." Isolated, as if 45 years of memories could be reduced to geographic inconvenience. I turned off the phone and walked upstairs to the bedroom Caroline and I had shared for the last 15 years of her life. Her side of the closet still held her clothes, dresses she'd worn to church, the sweater she'd knitted herself, the jacket she'd bought for Ethan's wedding. I'd never had the heart to give them away, and now I was glad. At Sunset Manor, there would be no space for Caroline's clothes, no room for the life we'd built together. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood settling into night. When I finally dozed, I dreamed of the lake house, not as it was now, but as it had been in the early days when Caroline and I were young and everything seemed possible. We were working in the garden she'd planted, her hands dark with soil, laughing at some joke I couldn't quite remember. The dream felt more real than the waking world, more true than the business suits and legal documents that had invaded my kitchen that afternoon. I woke at 5:30, the way I had every morning for the past 50 years. Caroline used to tease me about my internal clock, said I was more reliable than the rooster her grandfather kept on his farm. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching the sky lighten outside the window. That's when I noticed the folder on the counter, the one Harold Worthington had left behind. Inside were brochures for Sunset Manor, complete with glossy photos of smiling elderly people playing bingo and doing water aerobics. There was also a floor plan of a deluxe studio apartment that was smaller than the lake house's master bedroom. At the bottom of the folder was a contract. My name was already filled in, along with a move-in date of the following Monday. Ethan had signed as my responsible party and financial guarantor. The monthly fee was more than my Social Security check, which meant they expected me to sell something to afford it, something like a house on Elm Street that had 20 years left on the mortgage. I sat there for a long time, feeling something shift inside me, not anger exactly, but something colder and more focused. Caroline had always said I was too trusting, too willing to assume the best of people. Maybe it was time to be less trusting and more strategic. I pulled out the phone book. Yes, I still owned a phone book, and looked up Marcus Wheeler's office number. Marcus had handled Caroline's will, our taxes, the deed transfers when we'd paid off the lake house mortgage 5 years ago. He'd been Caroline's choice. She'd said he was the kind of lawyer who still believed in handshake deals and keeping his word. The office didn't open until 9, but I knew Marcus was an early riser. I'd seen him at the diner on Main Street most mornings by 7, working his way through a stack of papers and a pot of coffee that could float a battleship. At 6:45, I drove to the diner. Marcus was there, as expected, in his usual booth by the window. He looked up when I approached, his weathered face creasing into a smile that reminded me why Caroline had trusted him. "Frank, good to see you. You're up early. even for you. Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. I slid into the booth across from him. Is it possible for someone to transfer property ownership without the owner's knowledge or consent? The smile faded. Marcus set down his coffee cup and leaned forward. Frank, what's going on? I told him everything. The surprise visit, the deed transfer, the moving company scheduled for Friday, the contracts already signed. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, drumming his fingers on the table the way he did when he was working through a complex problem. Frank, I need to see the paperwork, all of it, and I need you to understand something. If what you're telling me is accurate, what your son has done isn't just morally wrong, it's potentially criminal. The word hung between us like smoke. Criminal. My son, the business executive in the expensive suit, might be a criminal. What do I do, Marcus? He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. First, you don't sign anything else. Not the moving company agreement, not the Sunset Manor contract, nothing. Second, you meet me at my office at 9 o'clock sharp. Bring every document you have related to the lakehouse, the original deed, insurance papers, tax records, everything. And third, Marcus's smile returned, but it was different now. Sharper, more predatory. Third, we remind your son that the apple might fall far from the tree, but that doesn't mean the tree is dead yet. I left the diner feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not just hope that I could keep my house, but hope that Caroline had been right when she'd chosen Marcus Wheeler to handle our affairs. Sometimes, she'd said, you don't need the fanciest lawyer in the biggest firm. Sometimes you just need someone who remembers the difference between right and wrong. The morning sun was breaking through the clouds as I drove home, painting the streets in shades of gold that reminded me of autumn afternoons on the lake. For the first time since yesterday's ambush in my kitchen, I allowed myself to think about the future. Not the future Ethan had planned for me, but the one I might still be able to claim for myself. At 73, I was about to learn whether I still had any fight left in me, and if Caroline's spirit was watching from wherever she'd gone, I had a feeling she was already placing her bets. The days that followed blurred together like watercolors in the rain. Wednesday morning, I canceled the moving company, a simple phone call that felt like the first step back towards solid ground. Thursday, I drove to Marcus Wheeler's office with a cardboard box full of documents that told the story of 45 years. Mortgage papers, insurance policies, tax records, and the original deed to the lake house with Caroline's signature next to mine in the blue ink she always preferred. Marcus spent 3 hours going through everything, his reading glasses sliding down his nose as he examined each document with the thoroughness of a man who'd spent 40 years protecting people from their own families. When he finally looked up, his expression was grim but determined. Frank, I've got good news and bad news. The bad news is that your son did file paperwork claiming you'd transferred the property to the Worthingtons as a gift. The good news is that he forged your signature to do it. Forged. The word sat heavy in the air between us, carrying implications I wasn't ready to face. My son wasn't just taking my house. He was committing fraud to do it. What does that mean, practically speaking? Marcus leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking like old bones. It means we can stop this, but it's going to get ugly. Are you prepared for that, Frank? Are you prepared for your son to hire his own lawyers, for this to drag out in court, for the whole town to know that your family is fighting over property? I thought about Caroline, about the way she'd handled conflict, never looking for a fight, but never backing down from one either. What would happen if I did nothing? You'd lose everything. The lake house, probably this house too, once they realize you can't afford Sunset Manor on Social Security alone. Ethan's counting on you being too old, too tired, or too sentimental to fight back. Too old, too tired, too sentimental. The words stung because they contained just enough truth to hurt. I was old. 73 years of living had left their mark on my joints, my reflexes, my faith in the basic goodness of people. I was tired of being alone, tired of maintaining 2 properties, tired of eating dinner by myself and going to bed in an empty house. And I was absolutely sentimental about the lake house, about every board and nail and memory Caroline and I had built there. But tired and sentimental didn't mean defeated. Do it, I said. Stop them. Marcus smiled, and for the first time since Tuesday afternoon, I felt like I wasn't fighting alone. The weekend passed quietly. I stayed in town, establishing routines that felt almost normal. Saturday morning, I drove to the hardware store and bought materials to fix the loose step on my front porch, a job I'd been putting off for months. Working with my hands felt good, reminded me that at 73, I could still swing a hammer and drive a nail straight. Earl Patterson, my neighbor for the past 15 years, wandered over with 2 cups of coffee and the easy familiarity of a man who understood that sometimes the best conversations happened over shared work. Heard Ethan was by earlier this week, he said, settling onto my front steps while I measured the new board. Fancy car like that doesn't go unnoticed in this neighborhood. Earl was 75, a retired mechanic who'd spent his career fixing things other people had broken. His wife Martha had passed 2 years before Caroline, and we'd developed the kind of friendship that exists between men who've learned that loneliness shared is somehow more bearable than loneliness endured alone. Yeah, he stopped by. I didn't elaborate, but Earl had the patience of a man who'd raised 4 children and knew when to wait for the whole story. Martha always said that boy would be trouble, he continued, sipping his coffee. Not mean trouble, you understand. Just soft trouble. The kind that comes from never having to fight for anything. I paused in my measuring. Caroline saw it too, toward the end. Said he'd gotten too comfortable with other people solving his problems. Well, she was a smart woman, your Caroline. Smarter than either of us, that's for sure. Earl stood up, brushing sawdust from his pants. You need help with anything, Frank. You just holler. I may be old, but I'm not dead yet. After he left, I continued working on the step, but my mind wandered to the differences between my generation and Ethan's. Earl and I had grown up during times when you fixed what broke, when you made do with what you had, when a man's word meant something because breaking it carried real consequences. Ethan had grown up in a world where everything was replaceable, upgradable, disposable, including, apparently, his father. Sunday morning, I drove to the lakehouse for the first time since Tuesday. I needed to see it, to walk through the rooms and remind myself what I was fighting for. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves. The maples around the property had reached peak color, reds and golds so vibrant they almost hurt to look at. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the silence. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. Caroline's reading chair by the window, the half-finished crossword puzzle still folded on the side table, the coffee mug I'd forgotten to wash sitting by the kitchen sink. But the house felt different somehow, violated by the knowledge that strangers had been here, had walked through these rooms, and calculated their worth in dollars rather than memories. I made fresh coffee and sat in Caroline's chair, looking out at the lake, where a pair of loons floated peacefully near the far shore. The morning sun painted golden paths across the water, and for a moment, I could almost feel Caroline's presence beside me, her hand on my shoulder, her voice whispering that everything would be all right. That's when my phone rang. Ethan's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, I considered not answering, but avoidance had never been my style, and it was too late to start now. Hello, Ethan? Dad, where are you? I drove by the house and your car wasn't there. The moving company said you canceled on them. I'm at the lakehouse. I kept my voice steady, neutral. And yes, I canceled the movers. A pause, then, Dad, we talked about this. The papers are already filed. Harold and Patricia are planning to move in next weekend. Then they're going to be disappointed. Another pause, longer this time. When Ethan spoke again, his voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. The tone of a man who wasn't used to being told no. Dad, you're not thinking clearly about this. You can't live alone in that big place anymore. What if you fall? What if you have a medical emergency? There's no cell service out there half the time. I've managed for the past year without Caroline. I think I can manage a little longer. That's different and you know it. Mom was there to help, to keep an eye on things. Now you're completely alone and you're not getting any younger. The words stung because they were true. I was alone and I wasn't getting younger. And there had been moments over the past year when I'd lain in bed listening to my heart beat irregularly and wondered what would happen if it simply stopped. Who would find me? How long would it take? But fear of dying alone wasn't reason enough to give up living. Ethan, I need you to listen to me carefully. I am not moving to Sunset Manor. I am not giving up the lake house, and if you think you can force me out with forged documents and legal tricks, you're about to learn something about your old man that you apparently forgot. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice was cold, businesslike, the voice of a stranger negotiating a hostile takeover. Dad, if you want to make this difficult, that's your choice. But the papers are filed, the contracts are signed, and Harold and Patricia have already put a deposit down on moving expenses. You're going to lose this fight, and you're going to make it expensive and embarrassing for everyone involved. Let me worry about expensive and embarrassing. Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. The line went dead. I sat there for a long time, listening to the silence and trying to reconcile the man I'd just spoken with the boy I'd raised. When had Ethan become someone who spoke to his father like a business rival? When had he learned to use love as leverage and family as collateral damage? That evening, I called Marcus from the lake house and told him about the conversation. Well, now we know where we stand, he said. Your son isn't backing down, which means neither can we. I'll file an injunction first thing Monday morning, but Frank, you need to prepare yourself for the long haul. This isn't going to be resolved with a phone call and a handshake. After I hung up, I walked out onto the deck where Caroline and I had spent countless evenings watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The air was cooling, carrying the promise of frost and the end of another season. Soon, the lake would begin its transition toward winter. The tourist boats would disappear, and the only sounds would be wind through bare branches and the distant call of migrating geese. I thought about Ethan's words, about being alone, about getting older, about the practical realities of maintaining a property this size without Caroline's help. He wasn't wrong about the challenges I faced. The question was whether those challenges were reasons to surrender or reasons to fight harder for what mattered most. Inside the house, I found Caroline's address book, the one she'd kept meticulously updated with phone numbers, birthdays, and notes about the people who'd mattered to us over the years. I called our old neighbors from the development, the couple who'd helped us plant the maple trees that now blazed with autumn color. Frank! Mary Kowalski's voice carried genuine warmth. Tom and I were just talking about you and Caroline yesterday. How are you holding up? I told her about Ethan, about the legal battle, about the choice between fighting and surrendering. Mary listened without judgment, the way Caroline's friends always did, with the patience of someone who understood that some stories needed to be told completely before they could be understood at all. You know what Caroline would say, Mary finally said. She'd say that house isn't just wood and stone. It's the place where you two became the people you were meant to be. She'd fight for it, and she'd expect you to fight for it too. But what if Ethan's right? What if I am too old, too stubborn, too set in my ways? Frank, Caroline used to say that stubbornness was just determination with an attitude problem. If you're determined to keep the home you built with the woman you loved, then be stubborn about it. Be impossibly, inconveniently, magnificently stubborn. After we hung up, I sat in Caroline's reading chair and began making lists, the kind of detailed, methodical planning that had gotten me through 40 years of marriage, raising a son, and building a life worth living. I listed my assets, my monthly expenses, my legal options. I wrote down the names of people who might help, favors I could call in, resources I hadn't considered. Most importantly, I made a list of reasons to fight, not just for the lake house, but for the principle that a man's life shouldn't be disposable simply because he's reached an age where his son finds him inconvenient. That 45 years of marriage and memories shouldn't be reduced to square footage and market value. That being 73 doesn't mean being powerless. By the time I finished, it was well past midnight. The house was dark around me, but I felt more awake, more focused than I had in months. Ethan thought he was dealing with a tired old man who would roll over rather than make a scene. He was about to discover that tired and old doesn't necessarily mean defeated, and sometimes the quietest men make the loudest noise when they finally decide they've had enough. Monday morning arrived with the kind of gray sky that promised rain and delivered disappointment. I woke at 5:30, as always, but instead of my usual routine of coffee and silence, I found myself standing in front of Caroline's dresser, looking at the framed photograph from our 25th anniversary. We'd taken a cruise to Alaska, her idea, my reluctant agreement that turned into one of the best weeks of our marriage. In the photo, we're standing on the ship's deck with glaciers behind us, her head on my shoulder, both of us laughing at something the photographer had said. She looked so alive in that picture, so sure that the future held good things. If she could see me now, standing in my pajamas at 73, preparing for legal war with our only child, what would she think? Would she be proud of my determination, or would she tell me to swallow my pride and move to Sunset Manor for the sake of family peace? The phone rang at 7:15, interrupting my breakfast of oatmeal and regret. Marcus Wheeler's voice carried the brisk efficiency of a man who'd been awake for hours. "Frank, I filed the injunction this morning. That should stop any immediate transfer of the property. But I've got something else we need to discuss. Can you come in around 10? "What kind of something?" "The kind that changes everything. I'll explain when you get here." I spent the next 2 hours in a strange state of suspended animation, unable to focus on anything, but unable to stop moving either. I cleaned dishes that were already clean, organized papers that were already organized, and found myself standing in Caroline's closet, breathing in the faint scent of her perfume that still clung to her sweaters. At 9:45, I drove to Marcus's office, taking the long way past the elementary school where Ethan had played Little League baseball. The field was empty now, autumn leaves scattered across the infield where he'd hit his first home run. I'd been so proud that day, standing in the bleachers with Caroline, watching our 8-year-old son round the bases with his arms raised in triumph. When had that boy become the man who could sit in my kitchen and calmly steal my home? Marcus's office was in a converted Victorian house on Main Street, the kind of place where the floors creaked and the radiators clanged, but the coffee was always fresh and the advice was worth paying for. His secretary, Mrs. Henderson, had been greeting clients for 30 years with the same combination of maternal warmth and protective fierceness. "He's waiting for you, Frank. And honey, whatever that boy of yours has done, Mr. Wheeler's going to fix it." Marcus was standing behind his desk when I entered, holding a manila folder that looked somehow ominous in the morning light. He gestured to the leather chair across from his desk, the same chair where Caroline and I had sat to sign our wills, where we'd planned our estate, where we'd tried to ensure that our son would be provided for after we were gone. "Frank, I've got news that's going to sound like I'm making it up, but I've triple-checked everything." He opened the folder and pulled out a legal document. "Your son made a mistake when he forged that property transfer. A big one." "What kind of mistake?" "The kind that proves he doesn't know as much about property law as he thinks he does." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a man who'd found the loose thread that could unravel an entire scheme. "When you and Caroline paid off the lakehouse mortgage 5 years ago, you didn't just own the property free and clear. You also triggered a clause in your homeowner's insurance that most people never read." He handed me the document, my insurance policy, thick with small print and legal language that might as well have been written in ancient Greek. Page 47, Section 12, GC. It's called a Fraudulent Transfer Protection Clause. Basically, it means that if anyone tries to transfer your property without your knowledge or consent, the insurance company has the right to investigate and, if fraud is proven, to take legal action against all parties involved. I stared at the page, trying to make sense of the legal terminology. What does that mean for Ethan? It means your son isn't just dealing with his stubborn old father anymore. He's dealing with Midwest Mutual Insurance, a company with very deep pockets and very expensive lawyers who don't like it when people commit fraud involving their insured properties. The implications began to sink in slowly, like water soaking into dry soil. "So, they'll fight the transfer?" "Frank, they're going to do more than fight it. They're going to investigate it. And when they find out your son forged your signature, which they will because they have forensic handwriting experts who can spot a fake from across the room, they're going to file criminal charges. Insurance fraud is a federal offense." Federal offense. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to catch. My son, my successful businessman's son, with his expensive suits and his careful reputation, was facing federal charges. "Marcus, I don't want to destroy Ethan's life. I just want to keep my house." "I understand that, Frank, and we might be able to work something out, depending on how reasonable your son wants to be. But first, he needs to understand the situation he's in." That afternoon, I drove back to the lakehouse, needing the peace of the water and the comfort of Caroline's presence to process what Marcus had told me. The October weather was turning, clouds building in the west with the promise of the first real storm of the season. I could smell rain in the air, mixed with the earthy scent of leaves beginning their final transformation. I was sitting on the deck, watching the waves build as the wind picked up, when I heard a car in the driveway. But this time, it wasn't Ethan's BMW. It was a silver sedan I didn't recognize, followed by a familiar black car that made my stomach clench. Ethan emerged from the BMW, but he wasn't alone. Madison was with him, along with Harold and Patricia Worthington. From the silver sedan came a man in an expensive suit carrying a briefcase. Obviously a lawyer, probably the kind who charged more per hour than I used to make in a week. I remained seated on the deck as they approached, letting them come to me rather than going to meet them. It was a small power play, but at 73 you take your advantages where you find them. Dad? Ethan's voice was carefully controlled, but I could see tension in his shoulders, uncertainty in the way he glanced at his lawyer before speaking. We need to talk. I'm listening. The lawyer stepped forward, extending his hand with the practiced confidence of a man who was used to intimidating people with legal jargon and expensive clothes. Mr. Sullivan, I'm David Brennan, representing your son in this matter. I think there's been some misunderstanding about the property transfer. I didn't take his hand. No misunderstanding. My son forged my signature to steal my house. That seems pretty clear to me. Brennan's smile never wavered, but something flickered in his eyes. Mr. Sullivan, I think you're operating under some misconceptions about the legal process. Your son was acting in your best interests with proper legal authority. Show me the power of attorney. Silence. Brennan glanced at Ethan, who was studying his shoes with the intense concentration of a man who'd realized he'd forgotten something important. Well, there are circumstances where family members can act on behalf of elderly relatives. Not without proper documentation there aren't. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 73 years, but determined not to show it, and not when the elderly relative is perfectly capable of making his own decisions. Harold Worthington stepped forward, his face flushed with the indignation of a man who wasn't used to having his plans disrupted. Now, see here, Frank. We've made arrangements, hired movers, put down deposits. We're not going to be jerked around by some senile old man who doesn't know what's good for him. The words hit like a slap. Senile. Old man. The casual cruelty of it. The assumption that age automatically meant incompetence. That years of experience counted for nothing when measured against youth and money. Harold, I said quietly, I suggest you get off my property before I call the sheriff and have you arrested for trespassing. Madison spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the kind of forced sweetness that made my teeth ache. Frank, we're family. Surely we can work something out that makes everyone happy. Family. I repeated the word slowly, tasting its bitterness. Family doesn't forge signatures. Family doesn't steal homes. Family doesn't call elderly relatives senile when they don't get their way. Ethan finally looked up from his shoes. Dad, this is getting out of hand. We just want what's best for you. No, son. You want what's most convenient for you. There's a difference. The storm was getting closer now, thunder rumbling in the distance like the sound of something large and angry moving across the landscape. The wind had picked up, sending waves against the shore with increasing force, and the first fat raindrops were beginning to fall. Mr. Sullivan, Brennan tried again, I think if we all sit down and discuss this reasonably, there's nothing to discuss. This is my house, bought with my money, improved with my labor, filled with my memories. And it's going to stay that way until I decide otherwise. Patricia Worthington, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. Her voice was thin, sharp, like wind through broken glass. Frank, you're being unreasonable. We're not asking for charity here. We're prepared to pay fair market value for the property. It's not for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price. Then you don't understand anything about this place, or about me. The rain was falling harder now, driving across the deck with the force of the storm front that had been building all day. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the boards beneath our feet. I think, I said, raising my voice slightly to be heard over the storm. It's time for you all to leave. Drive carefully. These roads can be dangerous in the rain, especially for people who don't know them well. Brennan made one last attempt. Mr. Sullivan, if you persist in this course of action, we'll have no choice but to pursue all legal remedies available to us. I smiled then, thinking of Marcus Wheeler and Midwest Mutual Insurance and forensic handwriting experts. You do that, Mr. Brennan. And when you do, make sure your client understands that insurance fraud is a federal offense. The FBI takes that sort of thing very seriously. The lawyer's confident smile faltered slightly. What are you talking about? Ask your client. He'll explain it to you on the drive back to town. They left then, hurrying through the rain to their cars, their expensive clothes no protection against the storm that had moved in from the west. I watched their taillights disappear down the gravel road, then went inside and made myself a cup of tea. The storm raged outside for another hour, lightning illuminating the lake in stark, dramatic flashes that reminded me of old black and white photographs. I sat in Caroline's chair, listening to the thunder and the rain against the windows, and thought about the conversation I just had. Ethan had looked scared toward the end, uncertain in a way I hadn't seen since he was a child. The mention of insurance fraud had clearly caught him off guard, made him realize that his carefully planned scheme had holes he hadn't considered. But what struck me most was how little he seemed to know about the man he was trying to manipulate. Ethan had spent so many years living in his own world of business deals and corporate politics that he'd forgotten the lessons I'd tried to teach him about character, about standing up for what's right, about the difference between being old and being weak. He was about to get a refresher course in all three. As the storm began to move east and the thunder faded to distant rumbles, I called Marcus Wheeler at home. "Frank, how did it go with your son's lawyer? I think Mr. Brennan is going to have some interesting research to do tonight. And Marcus, I want you to file a complaint with the FBI about the insurance fraud. It's time Ethan learned that actions have consequences." "Are you sure about this? Once we involve federal law enforcement, there's no going back." I looked around the living room, at the mantelpiece where Caroline had displayed our family photos, at the bookshelf filled with the novels she'd loved, at the window where she'd watched for my return from fishing trips. I'm sure. My son made his choice when he decided to steal from his father. Now he gets to live with the consequences. After I hung up, I sat for a long time in the gathering darkness, listening to the rain slow to a gentle patter, and thinking about the paths that had led us to this moment. Tomorrow, there would be lawyers and investigators and difficult conversations. There would be reporters, probably, and neighbors asking questions and family friends choosing sides. But tonight, for the first time in a week, I felt like myself again. Not a senile old man to be managed and manipulated, but Frank Sullivan, husband, father, veteran, homeowner, and a man who still had enough fight left in him to protect what mattered most. The rain stopped sometime after midnight, and I fell asleep in Caroline's chair, dreaming of storms that clear the air and wash the world clean. The FBI doesn't waste time when insurance fraud is involved. Tuesday morning, I was barely through my first cup of coffee when Marcus called to tell me that Special Agent Sarah Chen would be arriving that afternoon to take my statement. By Wednesday, they had already executed a search warrant on Ethan's office, seizing computers, files, and documents related to the property transfer. I learned this not from Marcus, but from Channel 7 News, which apparently had sources inside the federal building. The story broke during the noon newscast. Local businessman under investigation for insurance fraud involving elderly father's property. They showed footage of agents carrying boxes out of Ethan's downtown office building, his face briefly visible behind tinted car windows as he left with his own lawyer. The phone started ringing immediately. Old friends from the hardware store, neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months, reporters wanting to know if I had any comment about my son's legal troubles. I unplugged the landline and turned off my cell phone, then drove to the lakehouse where the silence was broken only by loons calling across the water. But the silence felt different now, not empty, but full of potential. For the first time since Caroline's death, I wasn't just reacting to what life threw at me. I was taking action, making choices, fighting back. Thursday morning, Marcus called with an update that made me understand just how deep Ethan had dug himself. "Frank, the FBI found something interesting when they analyzed the signature on the property transfer documents. Your son didn't just forge your name once, he forged it 6 times over the past 2 years. Bank documents, insurance papers, investment accounts. He's been managing your finances without your knowledge. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your son has power of attorney over your affairs, and you never signed the papers giving it to him. He forged those too." The implications crashed over me like a wave. Every financial decision for the past 2 years, every investment choice, every insurance payment. Ethan had been controlling it all while I thought I was managing my own life. "How much, Marcus? How much did he take?" "We're still going through the records, but it looks like he moved about $40,000 from your savings into an investment account under his management. The good news is the money's still there, earning returns. The bad news is he was probably planning to use it as collateral for a loan to finance the Worthingtons' retirement plans. $40,000. Caroline's life insurance money, the savings we'd accumulated over 45 years of careful budgeting and modest living. Money I'd thought was safely sitting in the bank, earning its small but predictable interest. What happens now? Now the FBI builds their case, and we file our own civil lawsuit to recover damages and ensure your property rights are protected. But Frank, there's something else you need to know. Agent Chen wants to interview you again tomorrow, and she's going to ask about your mental competency." "What do you mean?" "Ethan's lawyer is claiming that you're suffering from dementia, that you've been incompetent to manage your own affairs for years, and that your son was acting in your best interests. They're going to argue that you don't remember signing the power of attorney documents because of memory loss." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Dementia. Incompetent. They were going to claim that my mind was gone, that I was a confused old man who couldn't be trusted to remember his own decisions. "Marcus, I want a complete mental competency evaluation. Today. I want doctors, psychologists, whatever it takes to prove that my mind is as sharp as it ever was." "Frank, are you sure? Those evaluations can be intensive, and if there are any issues, there won't be any issues. Schedule it." The competency evaluation took place at the medical center in Minneapolis, a battery of tests administered by Dr. Patricia Hawkins, a neuropsychologist who looked young enough to be my granddaughter, but spoke with the authority of someone who'd spent years distinguishing between normal aging and cognitive decline. For 3 hours, she put me through tests I hadn't seen since my Army aptitude exams 50 years earlier. Memory exercises, pattern recognition, problem-solving scenarios, questions about current events and historical facts. She asked me to remember lists of words, draw geometric shapes, explain the meaning of proverbs, and describe what I'd had for breakfast 3 days ago. Oatmeal with cinnamon, orange juice, and coffee. Black, the way Caroline had always made it. When we finished, Dr. Hawkins reviewed her notes with the methodical precision of a scientist analyzing data. "Mr. Sullivan, I want to be very clear about something. Your cognitive function is not only normal for your age, it's above average. Your memory, both short-term and long-term, is excellent. Your problem-solving abilities are sharp. Your orientation to time, place, and person is perfect. If your son's lawyer wants to claim you're mentally incompetent, he's going to have a very difficult time making that argument stick." Relief flooded through me like cool water after a long drought. Whatever else Ethan tried to claim about my abilities, he couldn't take away my mind. Friday afternoon, I met with Agent Chen for the second time. She was a compact woman in her 40s with the kind of quiet intensity that made you want to tell her the truth, whether it helped your case or not. We sat in Marcus's conference room, a recording device between us, and she walked me through every detail of the past 2 weeks. "Mr. Sullivan, I want you to understand that insurance fraud is a serious federal crime. If we prove that your son knowingly and willfully submitted false documents to defraud an insurance company, he could face up to 20 years in prison and significant financial penalties. 20 years. At 38, Ethan could spend the next 2 decades in federal prison, emerging as an old man himself, his career destroyed, his reputation ruined, his life fundamentally altered by choices he'd made in pursuit of what he probably saw as a simple real estate transaction. Agent Chen, I want justice, but I don't want to destroy my son's life. Is there any way to resolve this without—" I struggled for the right words. "Without ruining him completely?" She leaned back in her chair, studying me with the appraising look of someone who'd spent years interviewing crime victims and trying to determine what they really wanted. That depends on your son, Mr. Sullivan. If he's willing to admit what he did, return all the money he took, and make full restitution for the damages he's caused, the prosecutor might be willing to consider a plea agreement. But he has to be honest about everything. All the forged documents, all the money he moved, all the lies he told. No more games, no more trying to claim he was acting in your best interests. And if he doesn't cooperate, then we'll build our case the hard way, and when we're done, he'll face the full weight of federal prosecution. That evening, I called Earl Patterson and asked him to come over for dinner, not because I needed help cooking or cleaning, but because I needed the company of someone who understood that sometimes life forces you to make choices you never wanted to make. Earl arrived with a bottle of wine, in the easy manner of a man who'd learned that the best conversations often happened over simple meals. We ate pot roast, Caroline's recipe, though mine never tasted quite as good as hers, and talked about everything except the reason I'd invited him over. Finally, over coffee and the apple pie I'd bought at the grocery store, Earl asked the question I'd been avoiding all week. "Frank, what are you going to do if Ethan goes to prison?" I'd been asking myself the same question for days, lying awake at night in the empty house, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine a future where my only child was behind bars and I was truly alone in the world. "I don't know, Earl. I really don't know." "You know what Martha used to say about family?" Earl refilled our coffee cups, the ritual giving him time to choose his words carefully. "She said family isn't just the people you're related to. It's the people who show up when you need them. Blood doesn't make someone family, and being family doesn't excuse bad behavior. But he's still my son." "Yes, he is. And maybe that's exactly why you need to let him face the consequences of what he's done. Maybe that's the last gift you can give him, the chance to learn that actions have consequences, that you can't steal from people just because they love you." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, two old men who'd outlived their wives and were trying to make sense of a world that seemed to change faster than they could adapt. Outside, the October evening was crisp and clear, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Earl, can I ask you something? Do you think I'm doing the right thing? Fighting this, I mean? Or am I just a stubborn old man who can't accept that maybe his son knows better?" Earl was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands like he was reading tea leaves. "Frank, I've known you for 15 years. I watched you take care of Caroline when she was sick, watched you handle her death with more grace than most men half your age could manage. I've seen you fix things that other people would throw away, solve problems that other people would ignore, stand up for what's right even when it wasn't easy." He looked at me directly, his weathered face serious in the lamplight. "You're not fighting this because you're stubborn. You're fighting it because it's wrong, and because somebody has to teach your son that being family doesn't give him the right to steal your life away. That's not stubbornness, that's integrity." After Earl left, I sat in Caroline's reading chair and thought about integrity, about the lessons we try to teach our children, and the way those lessons sometimes get lost in the complexities of adult life. I thought about the boy Ethan had been, curious, energetic, eager to help with projects around the house, and the man he'd become, comfortable with deception if it served his purposes. Somewhere along the way, I'd failed him, not by being too strict or too lenient, but by not making it clear enough that character matters more than convenience, that some things are more important than money or comfort or taking the easy way out. Maybe it wasn't too late for him to learn those lessons. Maybe prison wouldn't destroy him. Maybe it would save him, force him to confront the man he'd become and decide whether that was the man he wanted to be. Or maybe I was just an old man telling himself stories to justify sending his son to federal prison. Either way, the die was cast. Agent Chen had her evidence, Marcus had his legal strategy, and somewhere in Minneapolis, Ethan was meeting with his lawyer and trying to figure out how to talk his way out of the biggest mistake of his life. I fell asleep in Caroline's chair that night and dreamed of Ethan as a boy, standing in this same living room on Christmas morning, his face bright with excitement as he opened presents that Caroline and I had saved for months to buy. In the dream, he looked up at me with the trust and love that only children can feel for their parents and asked, "Dad, will you always take care of me?" I woke up crying, remembering my answer. "Always, son. But someday you'll have to learn to take care of yourself." It was time for that lesson to begin. Monday morning arrived with the kind of cold clarity that October brings to Minnesota. Frost on the windows, steam rising from coffee cups, and the sharp awareness that winter isn't far away. I was sitting at my kitchen table, reading the newspaper account of Ethan's legal troubles, when I heard cars pulling into my driveway. Through the window, I watched a convoy arrive, Ethan's BMW, followed by David Brennan's Mercedes, and behind them, a car I didn't recognize carrying two people in dark suits who had federal agents written all over them. This wasn't a social call or a family meeting. This was the end game. I finished my coffee slowly, deliberately, the way Caroline had taught me to savor small pleasures, even in difficult times. Then I walked to the front door and waited for them to come to me. Ethan looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past week. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult conversations with lawyers. When he looked at me, I saw something I hadn't seen since he was a child caught in a lie. Genuine fear. "Dad," he said, his voice hoarse, "we need to talk." Behind him, David Brennan looked like a man who'd been given an impossible case and was trying to figure out how to minimize the damage. The federal agents, Agent Chen and her partner, Agent Rodriguez, maintained the professional neutrality of people who had seen this scene play out dozens of times before. "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let them enter the living room, where Caroline and I had entertained friends, where we'd opened Christmas presents, where we'd shared 45 years of ordinary moments that had somehow added up to an extraordinary life. Agent Chen spoke first, her voice carrying the formal cadence of official business. "Mr. Sullivan, we're here because your son's attorney has indicated that Mr. Ethan Sullivan is prepared to make a statement regarding the charges against him." I looked at Ethan, searching his face for some sign of the boy I'd raised, the man I'd hoped he'd become. "What kind of statement?" Brennan cleared his throat, consulting a folder thick with legal documents. "My client is prepared to admit to certain irregularities in the handling of your financial affairs, Mr. Sullivan. In exchange for leniency from the federal prosecutor, he's willing to make full restitution and accept responsibility for his actions." Irregularities. I repeated the word slowly, tasting its careful blandness. "Is that what we're calling forgery and theft now?" Ethan flinched as if I'd slapped him. "Dad, I never meant for it to go this far. I was trying to help, trying to make sure you were taken care of. By stealing my house, by forging my signature, by moving my money without my knowledge." My voice remained calm, but something cold was building inside me, something that had been growing stronger with each revelation about my son's deception. "The house was too much for you to handle alone. You know it was, and the money, I was investing it, growing it. You would have gotten it all back, with interest." "That wasn't your decision to make," Agent Chen intervened, her professional demeanor cutting through the family drama like a knife through butter. "Mr. Sullivan, your son has admitted to forging your signature on 6 separate documents over a 2-year period. He's admitted to moving approximately $43,000 from accounts in your name to accounts under his control. He's also admitted to filing false insurance claims related to the property transfer. The numbers hung in the air like an indictment. 6 forgeries, $43,000, false insurance claims. Each admission was another nail in the coffin of the relationship between my son and me. What does he want in return for these admissions?" Brennan opened his folder and pulled out a document. "Probation instead of prison time, community service, a fine rather than federal prosecution, and—" He paused, glancing at Ethan. "He wants you to agree not to pursue civil damages." "Civil damages?" Agent Rodriguez spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight accent that suggested he'd grown up somewhere warmer than Minnesota. "Mr. Sullivan, in addition to the criminal charges, you have the right to sue your son in civil court for the financial and emotional damages he's caused. That could include not just the money he took, but punitive damages, legal fees, and compensation for the stress and disruption he's caused to your life." I looked around the living room, taking in the details that had become so familiar over the years. The mantelpiece with our family photos, the bookshelf filled with Caroline's novels, the window where she'd hung the crystal that cast rainbows across the wall on sunny mornings. This was the house where we'd planned to grow old together, where we'd imagined grandchildren visiting for holidays, where we dreamed of a future that included the son sitting across from me with fear in his eyes. "Ethan," I said quietly, "do you understand what you've done? Really understand it?" He looked up from his hands, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the boy he'd been. "Dad, I was trying to take care of you. The lake house is isolated, you're getting older, and after Mom died," his voice broke slightly, "I couldn't stand the thought of something happening to you out there, alone, with no one to help. So you decided to steal my home and put me in a nursing home without asking what I wanted? It's not a nursing home, it's an assisted living facility with full medical support. It's not my choice." The words came out louder than I'd intended, carrying 40 years of suppressed frustration with Ethan's tendency to make decisions for other people. "It's not your life to manage, Ethan. It's mine, and you don't get to take it away from me just because you think you know better." Silence settled over the room, like dust after an explosion. Agent Chen consulted her notes, Brennan shuffled through his papers, and Ethan stared at his hands like they belonged to someone else. Finally, I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where Caroline and I had taken evening walks for 15 years, where we'd watched seasons change and neighbors come and go, where we'd built a quiet life based on respect and trust and the simple pleasure of each other's company. "Agent Chen," I said without turning around, "what happens if I don't agree to this plea arrangement?" "Then we proceed with federal prosecution. Your son faces up to 20 years in prison, substantial fines, and the likelihood that he'll never work in finance again. His conviction would be a matter of public record, affecting his ability to find employment, secure housing, or rebuild his life." 20 years. I tried to imagine Ethan at 58, emerging from federal prison into a world that had moved on without him, his career destroyed, his relationships shattered, his life fundamentally altered by choices he'd made when he thought he was smarter than everyone else. And if I do agree? Probation, community service, fines, and restitution. He keeps his freedom, but he has a criminal record and the knowledge that his actions had consequences. I turned back to face my son, this man I'd raised from infancy, whose first steps I'd celebrated, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose college graduation had filled me with pride, whose wedding had made Caroline cry with joy. "Ethan, I want you to answer one question, and I want you to tell me the truth. Not what your lawyer told you to say, not what you think I want to hear, but the truth." He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and uncertain. "If your mother were sitting here right now, what would you say to her about what you've done?" The question hit him like a physical blow. His face crumpled, and for the first time since this whole mess began, I saw genuine remorse in his expression. "I'd tell her I was sorry," he whispered. "I'd tell her I was scared of losing you too, and I made terrible decisions because I thought I could control things, make them better, keep you safe. I'd tell her I forgot everything she taught me about respect and honesty and treating people the way you want to be treated." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so reminiscent of the child he'd been that my heart nearly broke. "I'd tell her I don't know how to be your son anymore without her here to show me how." The admission hung in the air like a prayer, raw and honest and more painful than all the legal documents and federal charges combined. This wasn't about money or property or nursing homes. This was about a man who'd lost his mother and panicked at the thought of losing his father too, who'd tried to solve an emotional problem with a business solution and ended up destroying the very relationship he'd been trying to protect. I walked back to my chair and sat down, feeling every one of my 73 years. "Agent Chen, I need some time to think about this. How long do I have to decide? The plea offer is open until Friday. After that, we proceed with full prosecution." After they left, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by the silence that had become my constant companion since Caroline's death. The autumn light was fading, casting long shadows across the carpet, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear children playing in the street, their voices carrying the carefreeness of people who still believed the world was fundamentally fair. I thought about justice and mercy, about consequences and forgiveness, about the difference between punishment and teaching. I thought about Caroline, about what she would say if she were here, about the values we'd tried to instill in our son and the ways we'd apparently failed. Most of all, I thought about the future, not just my future as an old man trying to age with dignity, But Ethan's future is a man who needed to learn that love doesn't give you the right to control other people's lives. By the time the streetlights came on, I knew what I had to do. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to feel good. But sometimes being a father means making the hardest choices of all. I picked up the phone and called Marcus Wheeler. "Marcus, I've made my decision about the plea agreement." "What do you want to do, Frank?" I looked at Caroline's photograph on the mantelpiece, at her smile that had sustained me through 45 years of marriage and 1 year of widowhood, at the eyes that had always seen the best in people, even when they disappointed her. I want to teach my son a lesson he should have learned 30 years ago, and I want to make sure he never forgets it. The silence on the other end of the line told me that Marcus understood exactly what I meant. "Are you sure about this, Frank?" "I'm sure. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way." The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, more like a conference room than the dramatic stage I'd seen in movies. Federal District Court, Minneapolis, Minnesota, November 15th at 2:30 in the afternoon. I sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecutor's table, wearing the navy suit Caroline had bought me for Ethan's wedding 3 years ago. Ethan sat 20 feet away at the defendant's table, flanked by David Brennan and another lawyer I didn't recognize. He'd lost weight over the past month, and his expensive suit hung loose on his frame. When he turned to look at me, just once briefly, I saw something in his eyes that reminded me of the boy who used to come to me when he'd broken something, hoping that Daddy could fix it and make everything right again. But some things can't be fixed. Some things can only be faced. Judge Margaret Thornton was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and the kind of presence that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. She'd spent 30 years on the federal bench, Marcus had told me, and she had a reputation for fairness, tempered with zero tolerance for people who thought they were above the law. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, addressing Ethan directly, "you've pleaded guilty to 6 counts of fraud, including forging your father's signature on legal documents and misappropriating funds from his accounts. Do you understand the seriousness of these charges?" "Yes, Your Honor." Ethan's voice was barely audible. "The prosecution has recommended a sentence of 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation and full restitution to your father. However, before I pass sentence, I understand that the victim in this case, your father, wishes to make a statement." Judge Thornton looked at me, and I stood on legs that felt less steady than they had that morning. Marcus had asked if I wanted him to read my statement aloud, but this was something I needed to do myself. This was something between my son and me. "Your Honor, members of the court," I began, my voice stronger than I'd expected. 6 months ago, I was a 73-year-old widower trying to figure out how to live without the woman I'd loved for 45 years. I thought my biggest challenge was learning to cook for one person and remembering to take my blood pressure medication. I paused, looking directly at Ethan. He was staring at his hands, unable to meet my eyes. Then my son came to my home and told me he'd given away the house where his mother and I had been happiest. He told me he'd forged my signature, moved my money, and arranged for strangers to take over the property where we'd planned to spend our retirement together. He did all of this, he said, because he loved me and wanted to take care of me. The courtroom was completely silent, except for the soft scratch of the court reporter's fingers on her keyboard. "Your Honor, I've had 6 months to think about what love means, what family means, and what it means to take care of someone. I've concluded that real love doesn't involve lying, stealing, or making major life decisions for other people without their consent. Real love involves respect, respect for a person's autonomy, their choices, their right to make their own mistakes." I turned slightly, addressing my words directly to Ethan, even though protocol required me to speak to the judge. My son forgot that I'm still a human being with my own thoughts, feelings, and desires. He saw an old man who needed managing instead of a father who deserved respect. He replaced conversation with deception, consultation with control. Ethan was crying now, silent tears that he didn't try to hide. Part of me wanted to stop, to cross the courtroom and put my arms around him the way I had when he was small and the world had hurt him. But that part of me had enabled too much for too long. "Your Honor, I don't want revenge against my son. But I do want him to understand that actions have consequences, that age doesn't make someone disposable, and that love without respect isn't love at all. It's manipulation." I sat down, my heart pounding from the effort of saying words I'd rehearsed 100 times but had hoped I'd never have to speak aloud. Judge Thornton studied her notes for a long moment, then looked directly at Ethan. "Mr. Sullivan, your father has just given one of the most thoughtful victim impact statements I've heard in 30 years on this bench. I hope you were listening, because what he described isn't just criminal behavior. It's a fundamental betrayal of the trust that should exist between family members." She paused, letting the words settle. "However, I also heard something else in his statement. I heard a father who still loves his son, even after being deeply hurt by him. That love doesn't excuse your behavior, but it does speak to the possibility of redemption if you're willing to do the hard work of earning it." The sentence was exactly what the prosecution had recommended: 18 months in federal prison, 2 years of supervised probation, full restitution of the money taken, and 500 hours of community service to be completed after his release. Ethan accepted it without argument, standing when the judge pronounced sentence, his shoulders squared in a way that reminded me of the teenage boy who'd learned to accept consequences for missed curfews and broken rules. After the hearing, I walked out of the courthouse into the gray November afternoon. Snow was threatening, the kind of heavy clouds that promised Minnesota's first real storm of the winter. I was fumbling for my car keys when I heard footsteps behind me. "Dad." I turned to find Ethan standing 10 feet away, still in his suit but without the lawyers, without the entourage, without the pretense that had surrounded him for months. Just my son, looking lost and frightened, and somehow younger than his 38 years. "Dad, I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but I need to say something." I waited, my keys cold in my hand, the wind cutting through my coat with the sharp promise of winter. "You were right, about everything. I forgot who you were, who I was supposed to be. I got so caught up in thinking I knew what was best that I forgot to ask what you wanted." He wiped his nose with the back of his hand, another gesture from childhood. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I know you are, son. Will you—" He stopped, started again. "When I get out, will there be a chance for us? Not to go back to the way things were, but to maybe figure out how to be father and son again?" The question hung between us, like snow that hasn't quite decided whether to fall. I looked at this man I'd raised, this stranger who'd hurt me more deeply than I'd thought possible. This son who was finally asking the right question, even if it was 18 months too late. "Ethan, that depends on who you are when you come out. If you're the same man who thought he could manage my life without asking my permission, then no, there won't be a chance. But if you're someone who's learned the difference between helping and controlling, between loving and managing—" I paused, choosing my words carefully. "Then, we'll see." He nodded, understanding that this was the best answer he was going to get. "Dad, what will you do? While I'm away, I mean." For the first time in months, I smiled. "I'm going to live my life, son. The life your mother and I built together. The life I choose for myself. I'm going to fix the dock at the lakehouse, plant Caroline's garden in the spring, maybe take that fishing trip to Alaska we always talked about, but never took." "That sounds good, Dad. That sounds really good." A federal marshal appeared at Ethan's elbow. Time to begin serving his sentence. They allowed him one last look back as they led him away, and I raised my hand in a gesture that was part goodbye, part blessing, part promise that the door wasn't permanently closed if he was willing to do the work to open it again. I drove home through the gathering dusk, past houses decorated for the holidays, past shopping centers bustling with people preparing for Thanksgiving, past the life that continued around us regardless of our private dramas. The radio was playing Christmas music. Too early, Caroline would have said. But I found comfort in the familiar melodies and promises of peace on earth, goodwill toward men. At home, I made myself dinner, meatloaf with mashed potatoes, Caroline's recipe, but seasoned to my own taste now. I ate by the window, watching snow begin to fall in the streetlight outside, thinking about the months ahead. 18 months. Enough time for Ethan to think about what he'd done, what he'd lost, what he might still be able to rebuild. Enough time for me to figure out how to be Frank Sullivan again, instead of just Ethan's elderly father who needed managing. After dinner, I called Marcus Wheeler to thank him for his help, and to discuss the practical matters that remained. The money would be returned, the legal fees settled, the property deed restored to my name alone. But more importantly, the principle had been established. I was still a competent adult with the right to make my own decisions, even if those decisions weren't what other people thought was best for me. Then I called Earl Patterson and asked if he wanted to come over for coffee and conversation. Not because I needed help or company, but because I wanted to share the news with someone who would understand what the day had cost and what it had been worth. "Frank," Earl said when he arrived, stamping snow from his boots, "how are you holding up?" "I'm free, Earl. For the first time in 18 months, I'm completely free to live my own life." We sat in Caroline's living room, drinking coffee from the good china she'd kept for special occasions, talking about everything and nothing, while snow accumulated on the windowsills and the house settled into the comfortable quiet of an evening well spent. Later, after Earl had gone home and I was preparing for bed, I found myself standing in front of Caroline's photograph on the dresser. She looked so young in the picture, so full of hope and plans and dreams for the future we would build together. "Well, Caroline," I said softly, "I think we taught him something today. Maybe not the way we hoped we'd have to teach it, but sometimes life doesn't give you easy choices." I could almost hear her voice in response, that mixture of sadness and determination that had carried her through the difficult decisions every parent has to make. Sometimes loving someone means letting them face the consequences of their choices, Frank, even when it breaks your heart to do it. That night, I slept better than I had in months, dreaming of spring at the lakehouse, of gardens planted and docks repaired, of quiet mornings with coffee and newspapers, and the freedom to choose how to spend each day that remained to me. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in white, making everything clean and new and full of possibility. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own decisions, its own opportunities to choose love over control, respect over convenience, truth over the comfortable lies that families sometimes tell themselves. But tonight, Frank Sullivan was exactly where he belonged, in his own home, living his own life, free to be the man Caroline had married, and the father Ethan might still learn to respect. The snow fell until morning, and when I woke, the world outside looked transformed, not just covered, but renewed, ready for whatever came next. I was ready too,